Have you ever felt completely overwhelmed, as if you were trying to control every detail of your life, but at the same time realizing that something isn't right? The feeling of being adrift, in the middle of a sea of worries, is something many can relate to. Life, with all its twists and turns, is like a roller coaster, moments of intense joy and, suddenly, unexpected drops. When you're in this whirlwind, questions arise: why am I going through this? How much longer will this last? But, no matter how hard we try, we can't control everything, and it is at this moment that true surrender happens. God knows what you're going through. He understands each of your struggles, even the ones you think no one else notices. When you surrender control to Him, you find a peace that goes beyond any situation. It's not about renouncing your responsibilities, but about trusting that, even in the chaos, there is a divine plan that you can't yet see, but can trust. When you let God lead, the peace He offers will be your guide. Life sometimes resembles a roller coaster, full of ups and downs that challenge us at every turn. At certain moments, it feels like we're completely out of control, being dragged by emotions and situations that arise without warning. And it's natural to ask ourselves questions like, why am I going through this? Or, how much longer do I have to endure? These uncertainties can be exhausting. However, it's important to remember that, despite the turbulence, God is by our side, understanding every detail of our struggles, even those that are more silent. Sometimes, it's in this chaos that He strengthens us and guides us. Life, like a roller coaster, challenges us not to lose perspective. While we may feel like we're losing control, it is in those moments that we're called to trust in something greater. Instead of worrying about the ups and downs, we need to remember that something deeper is happening. God knows what's going on, even when everything seems out of place. We can rest in His trust, even in the most turbulent moments. It's easy to fall into the temptation of thinking we have to control everything around us, that we need to be in charge all the time. But is that really necessary? Does God expect total control from us? Going through difficult times, it's common to feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of handling everything. However, we must remember that, even in the most intense struggles, God calls us to trust in Him. He knows what we're going through, and He knows what we need. This roller coaster of emotions can leave us feeling powerless. The uncertainties, fears, and worries can consume us, making us feel lost. However, by surrendering our concerns to God, we can begin to perceive a peace that transcends. We don't need to understand every twist of life's roller coaster, but we can trust that He is guiding us, even when we can't see the path. Daily surrender is essential, as it allows us to relax in the hands of the One who has everything under control. Imagine a roller coaster operator who knows every twist and turn of the ride. Although the passengers feel fear, He knows exactly what's happening and where everything will end. Similarly, God knows the trajectory of our lives, and even in the scariest parts, He is in control. When life feels out of control, remember that He knows every moment and is leading us to a better destination, even if we can't see the finish line. In life, like a roller coaster, we don't need to panic over the ups and downs. They are inevitable, but they don't define our future. True trust in God isn't based on having total control, but on recognizing that He is with us, guiding and protecting us, even when circumstances don't make sense. When we can surrender control to God, we find a peace that surpasses human understanding. He knows our journey and assures us that, in the end, everything will make sense. Even though life may seem unpredictable, we can find comfort in the certainty that God works with us through every phase of this roller coaster. The difficult moments, the drops, and the highs are opportunities to learn, grow, and trust Him more fully. When we surrender our concerns to God, we experience a deep rest, a peace that allows us to continue the journey without the weight of control. Often, in the midst of a whirlwind of problems and responsibilities, we feel as though we are the only ones carrying the weight of the world. The temptation to take control of everything, to believe we need to be strong all the time, is enormous. We feel that if we don't take the reins, everything might fall apart. But what we often fail to realize is that this burden is not ours to bear. God invites us to give this burden into His hands, to trust in Him, because, in the end, we are not alone in the struggle. He knows our limitations and desires to help us. When we talk about the burden of control, it's as if we're carrying a huge backpack full of stones, trying to bear everything alone. The pressure to fix everything, to please everyone, to make the right decisions constantly, can consume us. But God reminds us that we don't have to carry all of this alone. He is always ready to help us bear this weight, offering us His strength and wisdom. When we feel we can't go any further, He reminds us, "Give the burden to me and trust in me." However, surrendering control isn't easy. We are taught from a young age to be independent, to make our own decisions, to be strong and resilient. This, in itself, is not bad. However, when we take this to the extreme and try to control every aspect of our lives, we begin to suffocate our faith. True strength is in recognizing our limitations and trusting that God can do for us what we cannot. This doesn't mean we should be passive, but that we should trust in His timing and plans. Many times, when facing difficulties, the feeling that the burden is ours to carry prevents us from seeing the true solution. The fear of failing or losing control can be paralyzing, but the truth is that when we surrender our worries to God, we find relief. The weight we carry becomes lighter, and we can walk with more confidence. The Bible teaches us that, "The Lord is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble," Psalm 46 verse 1. He is ready to help us bear this burden. It's important to remember that the burden of control doesn't just mean trusting God when everything is going well. It also involves surrendering to Him when the situation seems out of control, when fear and insecurity take over. The struggle with anxiety, for example, can make us believe that we are the only ones responsible for finding the solution. However, by surrendering our fears and anxieties to God, He gives us the strength to move forward, even when the road seems difficult. When we stop trying to control everything and accept the peace that comes from God, we begin to realize that we don't need to be perfect. God loves us as we are, with our weaknesses and imperfections. And He is always ready to help us carry the burden. The peace we experience when we surrender control is transformative because it allows us to focus on what really matters and trust that God will take care of the rest. So, the next time you feel overwhelmed and try to control everything around you, remember, you are not alone. God invites you to surrender the burden of control, to trust in Him. This doesn't mean you should be irresponsible, but that you can rest in the fact that He is in control of your life. The peace that comes from this surrender is incomparable and allows us to live more lightly and confidently. Surrendering to God can be a difficult concept to understand, especially when we think surrender means simply letting go of everything and allowing things to happen on their own. However, the act of surrendering to God goes much deeper than that. It's not about abandoning responsibilities or being negligent. Surrendering is recognizing that there are aspects of our life beyond our control and trusting that God has a perfect plan for each of us. Sometimes, we surrender our concerns to Him but still try to control the details. God invites us to do something different, to trust fully in Him, even when we don't understand the process. Imagine you have a very serious problem and feel like there are no solutions left. You may even pray and ask for help, but deep down, you're still trying to fix it on your own. This happens to all of us at some point. True surrender requires the trust that God is acting, even when we don't see the results immediately. When we surrender, we're acknowledging that our vision is limited, and there's a greater plan that we may not yet understand. This process is daily and ongoing, because surrender isn't something we do just once, it's a decision we make repeatedly. Many times, we find ourselves in difficult situations, trying with all our might to control what's happening around us. But it's when we stop fighting the current and simply trust that God knows what He's doing that we find true peace. It's not an act of resignation, but an act of trust. When we surrender, we're affirming our faith in a God who is in control of all things, even when circumstances seem challenging. True surrender is about resting in Him, knowing that He has not abandoned us and that He is in charge. When we surrender something to God, we need to let go of the fear that things won't turn out the way we expected. Often, surrender requires us to let go of our expectations and accept what He has prepared for us, even if it's not what we imagined. This isn't easy, but it's necessary. Trust in God strengthens when we surrender not only our concerns but also our plans and desires. In the end, we know that He works for our good, even when we don't understand the process. Surrender is an act of faith and yielding to His purpose. When we look at the Bible, we see examples of characters who, even in times of great difficulty, surrendered their lives into God's hands. Daniel, for example, was thrown into the lion's den, but he trusted that God was in control. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew that surrender was the key to finding peace and security. When we surrender our lives to God, we should follow the example of these characters who, through trust and faith, saw miracles happen in their lives. Surrender doesn't mean we will be spared from difficulties, but that we will find strength and purpose in the midst of them. It's important to emphasize that surrender is an ongoing process. When we surrender something to God, it doesn't mean that the struggle will immediately end. The process of surrender requires patience and perseverance, especially when things don't happen in the timing we'd like. But the beauty of this process lies in the trust that God, in His perfect timing, will bring the solution. He works in silence, guiding us through difficulties. Many times, the greatest test of faith is maintaining this surrender, even when we don't see immediate changes. Peace comes when we trust that He is at work, even when we don't see it. So, when reflecting on the act of surrender, remember that it's not about giving up or running away from responsibilities. It's about recognizing that some situations are beyond our control and that God, in His infinite wisdom, knows what is best for us. When we surrender to Him, we rest in the promise that He cares for every detail of our lives and works for our good, even when we don't understand the paths He has chosen for us. Many times, when facing life's adversities, we feel extremely vulnerable. Losing control, even if momentarily, puts us in a position of fragility, and it's natural to fear this feeling. Vulnerability seems uncomfortable and even dangerous, as if exposing our weaknesses makes us more susceptible to failure or being hurt. However, it is in this state of vulnerability that we find a peace that surpasses human understanding. When we stop swimming against the current and simply allow God to guide us, it's at that exact moment that our peace begins to blossom. Paradoxically, true strength comes when we admit our weakness before God. The peace in vulnerability is not the absence of problems, but the certainty that we are not alone in facing them. When we feel powerless, when our strength seems to run out, it is then that we can rest in the promise that God sustains us. This kind of peace doesn't depend on external circumstances but on trust in God. He invites us to be vulnerable, to surrender our struggles to Him, and in doing so, experience a deep rest, even when chaos surrounds us. By acknowledging that, in our weakness, He is our strength, we find a peace that transcends human understanding. It's natural to try to control everything around us, especially during difficult times. We want quick answers and immediate solutions. However, by trying to maintain control, we become increasingly tense and anxious. The peace that comes from God, on the other hand, allows us to release the weight of expectations, pressures, and anxieties. We can see our vulnerability as an opportunity to trust God. In moments of uncertainty, when vulnerability seems like a burden, we can rest in the assurance that He is working in us and for us. Peace comes when we accept that we don't need to control everything. Allowing ourselves to be guided by God, in the midst of our vulnerability, is one of the greatest challenges of faith. And it is also one of the greatest sources of peace. When we recognize that we are limited and that the strength of our lives does not come from ourselves, we find a safe refuge in God's arms. He calls us to be vulnerable, to open our hearts, and to trust fully in His power. When we accept this vulnerability, we begin to realize that the peace that comes from God is stronger than any situation or problem. It is a foundation that sustains us, even when we feel weak. There are moments when our vulnerability becomes a silent strength. When we accept our fragility before God, we become more receptive to His intervention. It is not about a superficial peace, but a deep peace that gives us the certainty that, although we may not have all the answers, God is in control. Vulnerability, therefore, is not something to fear, but something to embrace, because it is in this state that God can shape our character and lead us to His purpose. It is in this place of surrender that we experience true peace. The peace in vulnerability also comes through prayer. By communicating with God honestly, without masks or temptations to seem strong, we can rest in His presence. Prayer, even in times of weakness, is a key that opens us to the comfort of God. In Matthew 11 verse 28, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." This invitation reminds us that, when we surrender in prayer, God's peace invades our hearts, allowing us to live, even in difficulties, with renewed trust. Therefore, if you find yourself in a moment of vulnerability, know that by acknowledging your weaknesses and surrendering your concerns to God, you are making space for a deep peace. There is no need to fight against what you cannot control. By trusting God, you find the serenity to move forward, even when the path seems uncertain. The peace in vulnerability is a peace that transcends any circumstance and is a gift God offers to all who surrender to Him. Trusting in God and surrendering our concerns to Him is not something that happens once, like a one-time event. On the contrary, it is an ongoing daily process. Every day we face challenges that make us question our abilities, leave us insecure, and often tempt us to take control again. But true surrender does not occur in a single moment of decision, it manifests day by day, in small choices of faith. Each day is an opportunity to strengthen our trust in God, to surrender our anxieties, and to rest in His promise that He cares for us. This daily process of trusting God requires patience. We live in a society that values quick solutions and immediate results. But God, in His wisdom, teaches us that He works in us through time. What we often want is an instant solution to our problems, but what God offers us is a process of transformation that takes time. By trusting in God's timing, we learn patience, perseverance, and, most importantly, a deeper faith. We cannot rush the process because He controls every detail, and His plan is perfect. Imagine facing a difficult situation where everything seems to go wrong. In such moments, the temptation to act on your own is strong. We want to solve things immediately, but the act of trusting God every day teaches us that not everything needs to be resolved right away. Instead of desperately trying to control every aspect, we can choose to rest and trust. By doing this daily, we can see how God guides us, giving us wisdom and direction for the next steps. Every small surrender brings with it a relief, as if a weight has been lifted from our shoulders. This daily process does not mean we will never feel fear or uncertainty. On the contrary, it is natural to feel this way at many moments. The important thing is to remember that trusting God does not mean the absence of doubts or difficulties, but the choice to surrender, again and again, what we cannot control. Each day, faith is strengthened as we recognize that, even when we don't understand what is happening, God is working in us and for us. Surrender is a process of maturation, and like any growth process, it requires time and patience. However, one thing is certain, God is always present in this process. Even though at times it may seem like He is silent, He is working behind the scenes, guiding our steps and shaping our character. God's silence is not absence, but a time of preparation, strengthening, and maturation. When we look at the scriptures, we see that many characters of faith also went through periods of silence and waiting. However, in each of these stories, God was working, preparing them for what He had planned. And it is precisely in this daily process that we can see transformation happening. As we surrender our concerns and anxieties to God every day, our trust in Him grows. He teaches us to live in the present, to rest in today, without excessively worrying about tomorrow. With every prayer, with every act of surrender, our faith strengthens, and the peace that comes from that trust begins to fill our hearts. The process of surrendering to God, therefore, is also a process of spiritual growth, making us more confident and closer to Him. Remember that each day is a new opportunity to trust God. No matter how many mistakes we make or how many times we try to take control back, He offers us His grace constantly. The daily process of trusting is, in fact, a continuous journey of transformation, where, over time, we realize that God was always with us, working in us and for us. There are moments in our journey when everything seems to be standing still, as if God were silent. Prayers seem to go unanswered, and difficulties continue with no clear sign of divine intervention. These moments of silence can be distressing, making us question whether God is truly listening to us or if He is absent. However, it is precisely in this silence that God is working. He is not absent, but He is molding us, preparing us, and strengthening us for what is to come. Often, silence is part of God's plan to teach us to trust Him more deeply. The silence of God does not mean that He has forgotten us. In fact, it is in this space that He invites us to grow in faith and patience. When we don't receive immediate answers, we are challenged to trust in what we know. God is faithful, and His will is always for our good. Silence teaches us to rest, to wait for God's perfect timing, and to trust that, even when we don't see visible action, He is working behind the scenes. Like a conductor who, in silence, prepares the musicians for the next piece, God is preparing us for what He has in store for us. Sometimes, silence is necessary for us to develop a deeper faith. In moments of despair, when everything seems to be falling apart, God is not silent because He doesn't care, but because He wants us to grow and trust in Him as we seek answers. Silence forces us to look inward and ask, what am I learning during this wait? How can I trust God more fully? He wants our faith to be refined and our relationship with Him strengthened during this silence. When answers don't come immediately, true trust is forged in the heart of those who continue to wait on God. However, as humans, waiting in silence can be difficult. The temptation to act on our own, to try to force solutions, is great. But when we surrender to trust, we realize that God has a purpose in this silence. He is guiding us toward what is best, even if we cannot see the path. As the psalmist wrote in Psalm 46 verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." Silence, then, is not something to fear, but an opportunity for trust and surrender. When we learn to wait on God, our peace grows, for we know that He will never abandon us. During God's silence, He may also be working on our character, preparing us for future blessings. Sometimes, we are so focused on our own plans and solutions that we fail to see what God is trying to teach us. Silence is an invitation to draw closer to God, to become more sensitive to His voice and direction. He wants us to trust Him and His timing, because He knows what is best for us. When we go through periods of silence, it is important to maintain trust that He is in control of all things, even when we don't understand what is happening. Patience, during God's silence, becomes a valuable virtue. In a world where everything happens quickly, waiting is a challenge. However, it is in the process of waiting that we learn to trust God more deeply. Patience teaches us to rest in His sovereignty and to be sure that He is in control. Even when we don't see immediate changes, God's silence is an opportunity for our faith to mature. He works in us during these times, creating a trust that transcends circumstances and temporary situations. Therefore, when you feel that God is silent, know that He has not abandoned you. He is working in your heart and life in ways that you may not immediately perceive. Silence is a fundamental part of the faith process, and it is in this silence that God prepares our hearts for the great things He has for us. Learn to rest in this silence, to trust the process, and to wait patiently for His intervention. In a world where everything seems to demand quick answers, waiting for God's timing may seem like an impossible challenge. We want our prayers to be answered immediately, for solutions to appear before anxiety consumes us. However, God has a perfect timing, much different from ours. Patience is a virtue that God wants to cultivate in us, but it is not easy to learn. In moments of waiting, we need to remember that God's timing is not rushed, but always precise, and He knows exactly when to act. It is precisely in the wait that He works in us, forging a stronger faith and deeper trust. When we face the need to wait, it is common to ask, "Why is it taking so long?" or "Has God forgotten me?" These questions arise, especially when the situation seems unsolvable. However, the Bible reminds us in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 11 that He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. God's timing is perfect, and sometimes He leads us through processes so that we can be shaped according to His plan. Patience, in this context, is trusting that, even when we don't see the results, He is working for our good. Waiting for God's timing is also an exercise in trust. Many times, our immediate desire is to get quick answers to our difficulties. But God, in His infinite wisdom, teaches us that waiting can be a time of preparation. What God wants to do in us often requires time to develop. Perhaps, when we think we are ready, He teaches us that there is more to learn, more to grow. This process of patience goes beyond simple waiting. It is an invitation to trust more and more in His direction, regardless of the external circumstances. God's timing can be unsettling, especially when signs of change seem distant. But when we look at the history of biblical figures like Abraham, Joseph, and David, we see that their greatest blessings came after long periods of waiting. God used those moments to teach them to depend entirely on Him. The same happens with us. When patience seems difficult, it is important to remember that God is preparing us for something greater. Each moment of waiting is an opportunity for growth and learning, and patience is the key to understanding God's purpose in our life. During this time of waiting, we can find comfort in the Scriptures. In Isaiah 40 verse 31, we read, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles, they will run and not grow weary, they will walk and not be faint." This promise teaches us that patience is not passive. When we wait on God, He renews us, strengthens us, and prepares us for what is to come. True patience is trusting that, even in silence and waiting, God is sustaining us, equipping us, and guiding us toward the right moment. Patience also teaches us to live in the present with more gratitude. Instead of being fixated on what hasn't happened yet, we can learn to appreciate the small blessings God gives us every day. When we allow ourselves to trust in God's timing, our perspective changes. We stop being consumed by anxiety and start living more fully, aware that each step of the journey is important and that God is with us in each one of them. Patience, then, becomes not only a virtue to be cultivated but a way of living in peace and trust. Therefore, remember, God's timing is not our timing. His patience with us is infinite, and He invites us to wait with confidence. When anxiety and impatience arise, seek strength in God to trust in His perfect timing. He knows what is best for us, and in the end, the wait is always worth it. What He has for you is greater than you imagine, and patience is the way to achieve that purpose. Prayer is one of the most powerful tools we have to surrender our worries to God. Often, in moments of struggle or uncertainty, we find ourselves with heavy hearts, trying to understand what is happening or looking for a solution to the challenges we face. However, prayer is not only a way to ask for something but also a way to release our burdens, to surrender, and to seek peace. When we pray, we don't need to use perfect or formal words, just a sincere heart that desires to connect with God. Prayer, in its essence, is the expression of our trust and surrender. It is common to think that we need long and complicated prayers, but the truth is that prayer is something simple. It is the moment we allow ourselves to be vulnerable before God. He knows our heart, knows what we are going through, and often the words that come out of our mouths are just a reflection of an internal desire to find peace. In Philippians 4 verses 6 to 7, we are reminded that, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Prayer is the key to releasing our anxiety and finding the peace that transcends all situations. Prayer is also a way to remember that we are not alone on our journey. When we turn to God in prayer, we acknowledge that He is our refuge, our safe haven. Even in moments of silence, prayer is a channel that keeps our connection with Him alive. Through prayer, we express our trust in His divine plan, knowing that even when answers do not come immediately, God is working in our lives. It is a constant reminder that our struggle is not alone, but that God is with us every step of the way. One of the greatest benefits of prayer is that it allows us to release the concerns we have, trusting God with what is beyond our control. Often, the weight of our anxieties prevents us from living fully. But, by praying, we can give everything to God and rest in His sovereignty. Prayer is not a request for control but a surrender, an act of faith that reminds us that, as much as we desire control, God is the only one who knows what is best for us. He knows every detail of our lives, and in praying, we acknowledge that. It is also important to remember that in prayer, God does not require perfection. He is not interested in our eloquent words but in the state of our hearts. What He desires is honest communication, where we can say, "I am tired, I am worried," or even, "I don't know what to do anymore." There is no need for masks or hiding our insecurities. In 1 John 5 verses 14 to 15, we learn that, if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. God desires that we speak to Him with the sincerity of a child who trusts in the love and care of their Father. Prayer also helps us align our desires with God's will. As we pray, we begin to realize that peace does not come from the immediate solution to our problems but from the understanding that God has a perfect plan for our lives. Even when we do not see the way ahead, prayer helps us trust that He knows what is best for us. It brings us the tranquility of knowing that He is in control of everything, and when we surrender our worries to Him, we are releasing the weight we carry to rest in His promise of peace. In summary, prayer is our daily opportunity to give everything to God, to trust in His will, and to seek the peace that only He can give us. No matter where we are or how we are feeling, at any moment, we can turn to Him in prayer. And by doing so, we discover that true peace is not the absence of problems, but the full trust that God is working in us and for us, guiding us toward His greater purpose. When we decide to surrender our worries to God, something profound happens in our hearts. As we release control and trust that He is in charge, a peace begins to settle in our being, a peace that goes beyond human understanding. Often, we are in the midst of emotional storms and difficult situations, but by giving everything to God, we find a peace that does not depend on circumstances. In Philippians 4 verse 7, the Bible speaks of this peace, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." This peace does not come from solving problems, but from trusting in the one who can solve them. The peace that transcends is that sense of tranquility, even when chaos seems to surround us. When we are able to surrender our worries to God, we are able to rest in the knowledge that He has a perfect plan for our lives, and in His wisdom, He will guide us. No matter how out of control the situation may seem, divine peace comes as a shelter, calming us and strengthening us. This peace is a reflection of the trust we place in God, knowing that He never fails and that, in the end, all things work together for our good. Like a safe harbor in the midst of a storm, He offers us rest. It is important to note that this peace does not mean we will no longer face challenges. In fact, problems may continue, but the difference is that now, instead of being consumed by anxiety and fear, we choose to live with the certainty that God is in control. The peace that transcends is that sense of rest, even when external circumstances have not yet changed. This is not a state of complacency but a decision to trust God, regardless of what is happening around us. When we surrender our worries, we allow divine peace to take over. But how can we cultivate this peace? The first step is the act of surrender. This does not mean running away from problems or ignoring them, but recognizing that we do not have complete control over everything. By entrusting our worries to God, He gives us the ability to rest, knowing that He is working on our behalf. Another key to this peace is constant prayer. Speaking with God honestly and openly helps relieve the weight of what we are facing, allowing His peace to surround us. The peace of God is an active peace, enabling us to face challenges with serenity. This kind of peace also comes with the trust that God's timing is perfect. Sometimes, we need to wait for answers or solutions, but during this time, divine peace helps us maintain calm and perseverance. In moments of uncertainty, we may feel fear or anxiety, but by seeking the peace that comes from God, we are able to deal with these emotions in a healthy way. It does not take away our challenges but gives us the strength to face them with courage. God's peace is not the absence of problems, but the assurance that He is with us every step of the way. The process of living in this peace is ongoing, something we must cultivate every day. It is not a temporary peace, but a lasting peace, one that grows stronger as we trust more fully in God. In a world that constantly challenges us to have control and seek quick solutions, God's peace is a refuge that teaches us to rest. By surrendering our worries and trusting in His sovereignty, we find a peace that goes beyond what we can imagine, a peace that sustains and guides us in all moments. Therefore, as we face life's tribulations, remember, the peace that God offers us transcends any circumstance. It is not achieved through control, but through surrender and trust in His perfect plan. As we rest in this knowledge, we experience true peace, one that is not affected by life's storms, but that strengthens us to face them with courage and serenity. Remember that surrendering control is not weakness, but an act of faith. When you give God your struggles, He not only takes them into His hands, but also offers you an incomparable peace. It is a peace that goes beyond your understanding, a peace that transcends the storms you face. By trusting that He knows exactly what you need, you begin to realize that, even in the most difficult situations, something greater is at play. Do not rush, do not distance yourself from the process. God's timing is perfect, and every day you are closer to understanding His greater purpose for your life. So, make a daily effort to trust, pray, and surrender. By doing this, you will see that control is not what brings peace, but trust in God. And over time, this peace will be your constant, regardless of the highs and lows. Life may be like a roller coaster, but by surrendering to God, you will find a stability that only He can offer.